tonight about building a 100% serverless healthcare platform in AWS. My name is Mark Gibaud and I am the CTO at vTail. At vTail, we're building a platform to connect US clinicians to the product reps and the sales reps of medical product companies that provide those clinicians with information about those products. So just like us in tech, they have a hard time keeping up with the innovation in their industry around medical products. And so we're building a platform for them to stay connected and keep up to date. So far, we have video calling, chat, news feed, a searchable medical products database, and then we've got a matching algorithm to match clinicians with their local reps from those companies. Right now, we're building a course catalog so they can find online courses to go on as well, and making a searchable database of those. So if we look at the technology paradigm, so we started with a blank slate in October 2020. I wanted to try and avoid some of the bigger mistakes that I had seen on previous projects that I worked on. Chief among those was Kubernetes. I know Kubernetes is very popular, but I'd seen entire DevOps teams kind of get swallowed up trying to get, deployment figured out using Kubernetes. So serverless was maturing nicely in 2020, I would say. And we decided to go down that route. And I eventually came to call our approach managed serverless. So that's a mashup of the AWS managed services and serverless as kind of the main runtime. So we provision a serverless platform via or using serverless framework mainly, and then some Pulumi on the side. And Pulumi, for those that don't know, is just basically a TypeScript layer over Terraform. So far we have no running boxes on our platform. No running servers. The other mistake that I'd seen in previous projects was either building your own stuff when you are probably better advised to pick some vendors to solve the same kind of commoditized problems. Either not using vendors at all, or sometimes even worse, using the wrong vendors. So we've lent quite heavily into trying to pick the best-in-class vendors for some of the functionalities that we want on the vTail platform. So you can see some of them there. We use Twilio for video calls. We use Stream for chat, Branch for app download attribution, Algolia for search, SendGrid for emails, etc. So we wanted to optimize for speed of delivery, and I think this has kind of got us most of the way there. We'll talk a little bit more about how using so many vendors can play well with an event-driven architecture. So this is a quick sort of summary of the front of the back end, if you like. So pretty straightforward architecture there. So we have AppSync and we have API Gateway. So we've got probably a dozen APIs through API Gateway, REST APIs for generating tokens or image uploads or webhook destinations or things of that nature. But most of our traffic actually goes through the AppSync server. So we have dozens of mapping templates, some written in Apache Velocity template language, which we'll see in a second, others going through Lambda, but one way or another, they often save data to a Dynamo database. If we look at the back of the back end, if you like, this is where we get into our event-driven architecture. So I've taken a sample API here called create item. So that might be an AppSync mutation, and that might be expressed as a vTail template or a Lambda, but either way, data gets saved into the Dynamo database, and then we offload a lot of work to the async kind of backend workers. The main way we do that is using a creatively named Lambda called the Dynamo Stream Manager that has an event source of the Dynamo Stream itself. And so that's kind of where you can get the old image and the new image of any database changes and kind of diff quite richly to understand what data has changed. So in this case, we understand that a new item has been created in the database. At that point, we save a new event into EventBridge called item.created, and then any number of things can happen. So if a user was updated, we replicate some of our user details over to Stream, our chat provider. That Lambda there might just update those user attributes in Stream. Or if a newsfeed item was posted, we might replicate that out to Contentful, where the app can download it later, those newsfeed items. And then if a new user is created, then we use branch.io to provision that user with a new or unique share URL. That actually works quite well. And yeah, so here you can see some code that just a range of methods that actually diff through changed data and translate that changed data into a event. It does require some eventually consistent thinking, and so what I mean by that is perhaps in another system you generate a share URL before saving a user to the database. And then in that case, you could say that a share URL was mandatory on the schema of a clinician. In this case, this is our GraphQL schema. But in our case, because we add a share URL to the user after they've been created, share URL here needs to be optional. And that means in certain edge cases, perhaps if branch was down, a user could not have a share URL, and in the app you need to do some null checking and some sort of error pop-up for that case. But we think it's worth the trade-off. The front end, the front end APIs can remain very simple and fast as well, because they're not doing much work. And then offloading some of the work onto the back end, you can take slightly longer, or you can be more flexible in terms of the duration and turnarounds of those lambdas. And also retriability is kind of built into the system. So lambdas with an async event source automatically retry twice. Most times that's enough. If you get some sort of error, branches down or just a connection error or something. Otherwise, we've provisioned a dead letter queue for most of these lambdas, and if branch is down for several hours and comes back up, we just redrive those messages, and the user eventually does get their share URL. We've also got up and running with AppSync. So what does AppSync bring to the picture? First and foremost, obviously, it's GraphQL. That gets you out of worrying about HTTP concerns anymore. So choosing verbs and designing response codes and having those response codes treated a certain way by the clients, etc., etc. So I'm old enough to remember SOAP web services, and REST was definitely an improvement over those. But ultimately, you sort of still were made to care about quite a lot of lower level concerns with REST. And GraphQL is nice in that it sort of gets you a little bit closer to the business language when talking about things. We've also found the schema is easier to manage and evolve. Some of this is about doing TypeScript front to back, and we generate some TypeScript types from our GraphQL schema. So a few different things in play there, but generally we found it easier than the old days of generating Swagger config and trying to keep things in sync from that perspective. Totally doable, but less work these days with GraphQL. And then what is AppSync? I think I've got a quick example here of we find it quite natural to bring in GraphQL schema into our technical specifications for features. Again, there's no sort of verbs and response codes here. It's quite easy and natural to understand kind of what make up objects when you're using GraphQL schemas. So AppSync is obviously AWS's managed service, managed GraphQL service. The main thing we like about AppSync is that it's wired quite nicely into other AWS services like Cognito and Dynamo. Here is a part of our schema that for which we have two sort of admin mutations that we'd like to lock down to a Cognito group called vTail admins, which is our sort of customer ops group. And it's nice to be able to do those with a single attribute or decorator and be done. And I think I've got an example here of a Dynamo or an AppSync mapping resolver that wires straight into Dynamo. So this gets you around having to have a Lambda, potentially with a cold start or even a warm start Lambda. The duration of a vTail mapping template into Dynamo is very fast. This one typically completes in about 45 milliseconds. And this is obviously a clinician getting their own data, so it's obviously a very popular or common API that gets hit. So it's nice to have the option to optimize for speed there. And of course, AppSync supports WebSockets stuff, so GraphQL subscriptions. And we found a great use case for that, which I'll explain now. So we have video calling on the vTail platform, and we use VoIP notifications to begin that journey. So the first kind of piece is quite a basic use case, not including GraphQL subscriptions just yet. But the first thing that happens is a caller hits a video call invite API. That API has the receiver ID. The receiver ID then gets a VoIP notification. And while that's happening, the caller just goes ahead and joins a Twilio video room and waits for a receiver to connect. The receiver gets their VoIP notification, and that's what kind of brings this screen up on your phone. If the receiver then accepts that call, the code is fairly straightforward to write to have that receiver just join the video, the Twilio video room, the ID of which is sent in the payload of that VoIP invite. So that's the kind of happy case, and that's all well and good. But the question is then whether either the caller sort of cancels the call or the receiver declines the incoming call. In that case, if the caller cancels, the receiver's phone carries on ringing, and vice versa. So you're actually on the hook for exchanging, the data to say that somebody's cancelled the call. I remember thinking there must be something like a VoIP notification that you can send again with some kind of cancellation token or something, but that's not actually the case. You're on the hook for doing this yourself. Level 2, as it were, was that the caller actually creates a call item in the database using a mutation called update call status. And then after running that mutation, the caller then issues a GraphQL subscription to that mutation. So any invocations of that mutation by any clients will feed that data, the changed data, back to the caller. After that, you can just see our some examples of our clinician calls in the database here. And there's the subscription itself expressed in the schema. Subscribe to any mutations called update call status, and when that happens, give me an object called update call status output. After that initial operation, the receiver gets their video call invite VoIP notification as normal. That has the call ID in the payload as well. And that receiver also, on receipt of that VoIP notification, sets up their own subscription on that call ID to update call status mutation. So that is, so then you have both the caller and the receiver subscribing to that mutation. When somebody then cancels the call, cancels or declines the call, they run the mutation again, and the call status is updated to ended. And the caller, the person who didn't create that mutation gets an update that call status has changed, and that's when you know to cancel the call on the person who didn't press cancel. So this is quite compelling and didn't take a ton of work to set up. and we're particularly excited around the group calling situation. We want to build the feature eventually when a clinician can call multiple people, say 5 people at a time, because actually they don't care who they talk to, they just want an answer to their question. So they could call 5 people, and then if the first one picks up, then you want to be able to cancel the other 4 quite quickly. So AppSync is certainly useful, but has its quirks. It's got 3 log levels. One is none, one is error, and one is all. The all log level is quite verbose, so there are probably some cost questions there at scale, but more than that, it will log PII, basically, because it basically logs the entire payload, etc. So that was a kind of a non-starter for us, but unfortunately when you set your log level to error, it does not log schema validation errors. So schema validation errors are when you ask for something that the schema doesn't have, some field or attribute that is not in the schema, because potentially things have gotten out of sync, or if you ask for something that is in the schema but is not fulfillable by AppSync because the data is perhaps not in a database. Both of those are schema validations and schema validation errors that don't get logged by AppSync. So our workaround is actually to log those from Sentry on the client, because the client obviously does get notified of those errors. I did explain the situation to customer support and said it would be nice if any kind of errors were logged when the log level is error, and they said that they have logged a ticket with the feature team, so we'll see, maybe that improves in future. And secondly, we have Datadog in play, and Datadog alerts set up to inform us via Slack of any errors in the lambdas. Those errors in the sort of general lambdas are obviously logged as logging.error, so the error level, which is all fine. But AppSync does not log at the error level. It logs everything as info, just kind of one of the quirks really. And so we need to do some extra things in Datadog to be able to be informed of those errors. So this is a query you can see in the middle there. This is a Datadog alert, or a monitor as they call it, but we actually have to amend the query not to just give us everything with status error, but in this case give us things with status info with the errors attribute or array greater than 0 items. So a little bit of, well, that's the easy way to get it going. Datadog for more advanced use cases does have the concept of log post-processing. So you could sort of rewrite your logs, and in this case, this is setting up something to rewrite the status to error, the status key to error value when the field in error attribute of the log statement is true, and that is the case for AppSync errors. So multiple options there, but a little bit of extra stuff to do in your monitoring platform to keep on top of any AppSync errors. So lastly, we'll take a quick look at EventBridge. So I've got a slide here called EventBridge, the tool. The tool is, for me, the slightly less exciting part of it. In terms of the new way to develop software these days. It's got the concept of a rule, and so a rule is just a mapping of an event to a target, and a target can be a Lambda, or it can be another API in API gateway, or it can be a AWS API destination, or it can be an SQS or SNS queue, and it can also be another event bridge in the same account or in a different account. So a variety of options there, but the max targets is 5, and so if you want more than 5 things to happen on a single event, you're going to have to rework your architecture a little bit. We haven't hit this rule yet, but it did occur to me as a very un-AWS kind of limit, because they normally give you 10 times of what you need, certainly to start out with. The latency can be up to half a second to invoke a target. So if you have time sensitive things like our previous VoIP notification example, for our VoIP notifications, we still have gone with SQS because that's typically 50 milliseconds or even shorter. And then it can also ingest third-party events or events from third parties like Datadog. So that kind of gets you around needing to provision, webhooks over HTTP. It's probably a slightly faster and more scalable way to do things. But the slightly more exciting part for me is EventBridge, the enabler. So this is a little markdown file that I actually just created for this talk. It lists most of our core events. And what we found very quickly is that they serve as a nice kind of map of the platform. So any new starter can really get to grips quite easily with how the business works or how the sort of business rules are implemented in the platform. And these are all, first-class EventBridge events. And so they have, these events serve as the sources, the event sources of Lambdas. So it's easy to sort of track what happens where. And then the second thing sort of off the back of that is new incoming requirements can often be expressed just as a new Lambda with one of these current events as the event source to be able to say send a new email to a clinician when they update their profile or get updated, or a new push notification when a new company is added to the platform. So it gets us, again, like I said a bit earlier, it gets us more easily talking about the business in terms of the business language and helps with communication with our stakeholders, etc. So my little markdown file is cool there to start off with, but you can imagine as things scale, you can imagine better solutions for these things. So EventBridge Canon is basically a postman for your EventBridge. So you can kind of in a local development environment play around with event schemas and sort of publish events to your EventBridge and then be testing your sort of invoked Lambdas much more easily than maybe the command line, etc. And then Atlas is a way to point, or you can point Atlas to your EventBridge instance, and it will scan your schema registry and kind of collect data about your events there, and then you can generate an API like documentation site. So Slate is one format that it supports, and you can, you've probably seen documentation sites in Slate before around APIs. I think Stripe's API docs are in Slate, and so you can get the same thing for your EventBridge events. So the tool around scaling this stuff is coming along, and it would help you. I can easily imagine that it helps you keep things sane and sensible when you've got dozens of developers and several product teams, etc. So just to finish up, my takeaways are, there's a lot to learn actually at the infrastructure configuration level. 5 or 10 years ago, application developers were much less sort of involved in infrastructure config. Now you've got to learn as an application developer what your Lambda account level concurrency is, what's the max number of targets for an EventBridge event, that Cognito can only send 50 emails a day before you need to do some extra work to integrate SES, things of that nature. But ultimately, it's still an exciting space to work. It's still very quick thing. We still develop and deploy things in days, maybe weeks, rather than months where I've been before. And I also have not you don't typically finish a project and start a new one the next day and want to use all the same stuff, most of the same stuff again. I've left projects before and said, I'm just never using those things again. I've learned how not to do it. But with the serverless event-driven architecture paradigm, I would use a lot of the same things again if I were to start a new project tomorrow. That said, the only thing I do think is missing in action still, with the greatest respect to the Aurora Serverless V2 team, is a true serverless relational database system from AWS. So Aurora Serverless 2 isn't quite there yet because it doesn't sort of scale to zero, and it can't easily be part of an ephemeral stack of when we've got 20 developer stacks inside a single AWS account, etc. But it will probably it feels like it's evolving. It'll become that in time, I think. But we still are only using Dynamo. And we have a couple of parts of the vTail platform that would fit better into a relational database paradigm. And so we're actually looking at CockroachDB or PlanetScale or one of the vendor relational databases for those. And that's all I had. So I hope that was interesting and useful. Happy to take any questions.
Great stuff from Mark, who joins me right now on thanks to the magic of Skype. Hello, Mark. Whereabouts in the world are you? You're in the UK, right?
Yes, Southeast London. So
right.
Also another London one.
But that accent is not a Southeast London accent. Where are you from originally?
Originally South Africa, yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. We actually have somebody joining us from Zimbabwe, according to the chat, which might be our furthest. Actually, I don't know. Is Zimbabwe further away than Brazil? Someone do the maths and let me know. That might be the distance winner. Anyway, Mark, thanks for sharing details of your endeavours. Does serverless live up to the promise? Is it cheaper? Is it easier? Is it faster? Is it more scalable?
I generally, obviously, I'm very biased now. I generally think so. I think there is, it's not a silver bullet. There's tons of stuff to learn, but it's certainly it was fast to begin for vTail when we had a small team or a smaller team than we have now. We still got a pretty small team, but we started quite quickly. We built and launched an MVP in 3 months, and that doesn't tell you everything you need to know necessarily. But the thing I have noticed is that we've maintained velocity, so things have scaled out and become sort of more complex. But that hasn't actually slowed everything down, just because everything's remains. Deployments still take about 9 minutes. Lots of lambdas are doing small things, so tweaking any one thing is still kind of as simple as it was in month 2 or 3. So I think it scales really well. More developers and eventually more teams, hopefully. But it's not a silver bullet, and there's still plenty to learn.
And was that sort of rapidity? That's a shit word, isn't it? It was that quickness of getting to market predicated on having a particular skill level in the team? Like, was this all kind of people who'd worked with serverless before? Were you learning as you went? Like, how did that look?
Yeah, so we did contract a specialist consultancy that specialized in serverless, so I sort of chose that technology and then looked around for specialists. So we did have people that knew what they were doing, both on the serverless and Lambda as a runtime thing, and also Dynamo, because I didn't mention it in the presentation, but we do use single table design to be able to use Dynamo for our only real database. There was some prior experience.
Right. Yeah. So you kind of leaning on expertise from the market rather than necessarily building it all in house. Which, as someone who's running a consultancy, that's a really great idea. You should all do that where necessary. But yeah, that seems. I mean, it seems like that contributed to the success, right? You don't sort of make the mistakes that everybody's made, because the people that you've hired have done that on their previous projects, and they bring the good stuff to you.
Yeah, and then off the back of that, we no longer, we rolled off with that consultancy, and I hired a couple of developers that I'd worked with before previously, and these guys were actually React Native specialists, and they were able to adapt to a full stack environment quite a lot easier, given that it was serverless, and a lot of the patterns were figured out, and a lot of the patterns didn't change over time dramatically, and were fairly straightforward even for React Native specialists. So that's serverless has got that going for it as well. It's relatively simple to learn the basics.
Great. And you're doing stuff in the healthcare kind of arena, so that immediately for me sort of sounds the compliance, security, PII alarms. What are the things that you've had to bear in mind or treat differently in that landscape than you would have done had you not been building a healthcare app?
Yeah, so it's mostly, as you say, around compliance and data protection. The regulation in the healthcare industry, we're in the US market, by the way, and it's HIPAA. That is the big one there. The quickest thing to learn about HIPAA is that it's pretty dated. It is actually, just first in 1996, published as law, and it's had a couple of updates since, but basically GDPR is a lot tighter than HIPAA. But basically, you can just do, what we, I think, in 2022 regard as common good practice around data security and encryption at rest and in transit, et cetera, and you'd be completely up with the regulation. There are some things at the edge, like they've got a super version of PII, which is PHI, Protected Health Information. We have our chat system that our users could potentially exchange PHI in the chat system. We have actually offloaded that. We don't store our own chat messages. We store them in our provider called Stream, and we've signed a BAA with them, which is a HIPAA thing. So we've offloaded some of that work and otherwise done the basics really well, I think.
Yeah, good. I guess you mentioned common security good practice. I think the thing I've learned over the last few years is that it's not actually
Not
common.
very.
It's as common as common sense. It's not evenly distributed, but it's reassuring to know that people who are working in the healthcare sector do follow those kind of things. I guess you wouldn't be allowed to trade otherwise, right? You get sort of audited, and the people who were buying from you would go, "Oh no, thanks very much. You seem not to be for us." So yeah, good stuff there. So a couple of questions from the chat. One that came in sort of fairly early on when you were talking about sort of best in class services. How do you determine which particular third party offering is a best in class when they all have their advocates? For example, why SendGrid and not SES?
Yeah, really good question. It's the first thing I can say is it is completely subjective to a degree. I think there are various ways that you can kind of do some due diligence to understand the landscape of a lot of vendor options before kind of diving in. I've been guilty in the past, in previous lifetimes and projects of kind of picking the first thing that looks about right and then going straight in. But I think taking some time, days or weeks to understand the landscape and compare and contrast providers before making what is essentially a long-term commitment is definitely par for the course. I ask around a lot, fellow CTOs, people have got war stories. There's always word on the street about this vendor or that vendor kind of not having a good integration experience, etc. So yeah, look around a lot, get invited to demos or organize demos with the vendors, read the documentation. Documentation over the last decade has really become one of the selling points of the big vendors that really do documentation properly, pay a lot of attention to the developer experience. One trick I like to do is use Crunchbase to understand people's vendors' funding history. If they've raised a lot of money and they've raised progressively more money over the years, then you know that they're on a good pathway, or can reasonably assume that they're on a good pathway. And then the other thing I like to do as well when looking at vendors is ask for their public roadmaps, or some of them maybe you have to sign an NDA, but you can get hold of their sort of where they're going to invest, hopefully some fresh funding over the next 12 months, and using that you can understand whether they're a sort of long-term fit, or how aligned they are with which parts of their product you want to use versus which ones they are investing in. That said, the SendGrid example was brought up. Some providers I'm a little bit more ambivalent about than others in our stack. SendGrid is kind of it does what it says on the tin, but it doesn't set our world on fire. The Stream chat is really compelling. I recommend anybody thinking about a chat vendor to look at Stream first. And then, some of the popular names, Algolia for search, and Contentful is emerging as a really compelling headless CMS provider. So we think we've got it more right than not.
Yep, no, it sounds good. I guess if you're bringing consultants in, they kind of bring their opinions to add to the mix as well. And I think the thing that sort of chimed really for me, because I guess that's how we know each other outside of this community, right? We sort of hang out in the same CTO circles, and that community is a really good way of finding out sort of how things are going for people. I think that if there's a theme for this evening, it's kind of that. I think Elvia and Ashley were talking about sort of community of practice and sort of learning from each other. You've mentioned this in the case of vendor selection. This in itself is a community event, and I believe really strongly in the power of community. So it's good to hear that's working for you as well. One question from the chat as well that actually I was going to ask, but it's great that Matt Crocs 1985 is asking, first time caller from, well, he's a fellow Safa. Matt, are you in the UK, or are you actually in South Africa right now? You can answer that whilst I ask you a question of Mark. Matt is asking, how do you set up developer serverless environments? Are you using shared kind of lower tier environments, or do you sort of end-to-end stack per developer? Like, how does that work when you're trying to change all of these sort of disparate moving parts? What does that look like for you guys?
Yeah, so that's a really compelling story so far. So we use each developer has their own stack, all top to bottom serverless, a complete sort of isomorphic version of production, and we have about 4 or 5 developers flexing depending on who's doing what and what time of the year it is, type thing. But then we have an integration test pack that runs and deploys we have about 25 of these. They also deploy their own stack. So we have an AWS developer account, development account with 30 or 40 stacks in it, and it seems to cope okay at the moment. So it's really powerful for each developer to have their own complete copy of production in that way, with no sort of mocks or clones or no mocks. It just means that we then further have a staging and then obviously a production environment. It means that our staging environment is actually way more solid and reliable than previous staging environments from previous projects that I've worked in, where the staging environment is kind of the first place you start to understand everything, whether everything works together. So yeah, that's a really compelling story. And some of my criticism of Aurora Serverless v2 and that it doesn't scale to 0 means it doesn't fit into that concept of an ephemeral stack as easily as Dynamo and other things as well.
Yes, because it's still generating cost for each of those things, which I guess is the trade-off for the fast warm-up time, right? The use case, I think, for Aurora Serverless is more kind of production workloads, whereas I can see the benefit of being able to scale it down entirely for a dev workload. So maybe that's coming. Maybe that's V3. Let's see. A question from Gavin Cornwell, who asks, do you have one large deployment for the whole system, or do you split it up into microservices? I guess that's a question about how you get your software live, and I'm kind of interested in are you sort of bought into the code deploy stuff and its sort of native integration, or are you using one of the third-party CI tools for that?
Yeah, we've gone Circle CI for deployment, and as I mentioned there, we use Serverless Framework. We were very lucky that we started in October 2020, and that December 2020 reInvent, they upped the CloudFormation stack limit, resource limit from 200, which was quite tight, to 500. So that gave us a load of headroom to not actually have to split out our microservices or split out our serverless stacks way more earlier than we would have had to have done. We've actually just done this over the last 2 or 3 months, converting over to Serverless Framework v3, which is a big upgrade. And now splitting up stacks as well, and it's totally doable. Serverless Framework have some newer tools, one called Serverless Compose, which allow you to manage separate stacks more effectively or with less effort. So we're starting to do that now, but we haven't had to do that for a long time. The other big contributor is AppSync. I think AppSync allows you to get away with fewer resources than a REST API with 50 or 60 individual REST APIs with their log groups, etc., all taking up resources. So good.
Yeah. So your developer. So I'm inferring from this that your developer lifecycle is you've got people who are working locally on something. Maybe there's some local tests they can run. They're committing. That's running some deploy job that might take some number of minutes into a dev stack that is entirely theirs within your development accounts, and then your tests are running, and you're sort of proving whether or not that worked okay. Is there scope for speeding that up? Is serverless and the deployment process there kind of the bottleneck, or is something else the thing that would be in the way of that?
No, that's as you say, that deployment is about it's about 9 or 10 minutes now. Actually, we're crossing from Webpack to ES Build recently. That took it down to basically halved it, because the Webpack is quite slow compared to ES Build. They've got better tree shaking and bits and pieces in ES Build. So single digit minutes is completely acceptable for our deployment. We don't find it to be a bottleneck. We do have integration tests, etc., that run on PRs when we ship those. So there is some wait time involved in getting those tests to run and pass. But at the moment, it's still. I do a lot of specification work rather than development work, and myself and a product manager still struggle to keep up with 3 developers to specify the work as quickly as they can get through it.
Yeah, that's pretty good. And the integration tests, are they running sort of? You're not deploying the integration tests into Lambdas, or you are running them into Lambdas, and then you're end-to-end testing the stuff in the dev pipeline?
Yes, we are. So those integration tests are basically hitting APIs and AppSync endpoints.
Gotcha. Another question from the chat before we wrap up. Gibaud 2001 says, "Did you consider SAM to run serverless locally for developers?"
I see people doing this online sometimes. We didn't actually try out using SAM for much of anything. I think you can easily find online there are some drawbacks to SAM. I think it tries to I think basically cloning or mocking AWS services in running things locally is just not really worth it in the final analysis. If you are in a situation to allow developers to provision their own stacks, it's easiest, I think, just to get the local unit test running locally, but otherwise deploy your stack and actually test against real cloud infrastructure is the quickest way to get it done.
Yeah, good. That I think we're seeing that in the field, the work that we do. That's the most common thing, I think, which is interesting for me, because I grew up in a time where you desperately wanted to run everything on your Vagrant box or your laptop or whatever, so that you didn't have all these dependencies. But I think the serverless story seems to be that you kind of can't really do that in any meaningful sense, and actually everything is quick enough and abundant enough that you sort of don't really need to worry about local mocking of stuff. So that was a hurdle for me to get over mentally, because of my background, which it spans the same kind of length of your career. I noticed you mentioned SOAP, and I suddenly had horrifying flashbacks to API calls that returned like 200 OK statuses, but actually had an error in the body and all sorts of other kind of horrifying mess. I don't miss that at all. Harking back
Which
to...
is ironically Sync does as well, so things change as much as they stay the same, or whatever they say.
Typical, yeah, standard. So harking back to my earlier rundown of what's changed in the AWS ecosystem in the last couple of months, are you benefiting from the ability to share test environments between developers, or sorry, test events between developers with Lambda? Is that something that you've been able to use?
I did see that announcement. Unfortunately not. It did strike me as a bit of a UI thing, and we spent some time in the UI, but in the AWS console. So I think if that is already your workflow, you probably benefit from that. But that wasn't one that we jumped for joy with, no.
Fair enough. And the ability to configure 10 gigs of ephemeral storage for Lambda functions. Were you topping out your storage requirements for Lambda?
No, we're pretty lightweight. We do we do most of our storage stuff in S3, as I guess many people do. So yeah, that sounded quite situational for that extension of Lambda, but I'm looking forward to having that use case at some point in the future, but
Yeah,
not yet. No.
yeah. I think that's sort of data science and those kind of things, which I guess you're not doing a huge amount of in the main part of your product. But great, thanks for sharing today, Mark, and thanks for answering the questions that come up. No doubt we will cross paths again soon, but wish you all the best success for the future of vTail.
Awesome. Thanks very much, John.
Thanks very much.